Hi, and welcome to Filmmakers Compass Podcast, a show where we talk about movies and, well, more movies. I'm D-Man, joined by CP. CP, how are you doing today?
Really excited about this episode.
I know, this is something we've actually teased in previous episodes, so our topic this week is going to be a little bit different than normal, and we're going to get into a really in-depth and probably long conversation about...
Am I supposed to? You were throwing it over to me, and I
was trying to throw it over to you.
Okay, gotcha. All right, let's do that again. Build it up for a little bit more, tension for the audience here.
All right, CP and I are about to dive deep into a fantastic, long conversation about
Marvel's Endgame versus DC's Justice League.
All right, I'm super excited. Now, CP, before we actually do start this discussion, as always, we have shout outs at the top of the episode. So let's go ahead and, let's see what we got. So first up is Eric Drucker, who said, solid episode. I'm looking forward to seeing Demeter also, so I hope it is good. And CP, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
On Demeter, as I posted on social media, slightly disappointed. Could have been an amazing movie if Amblin did what essentially the studio was built on, which is, hey, let's not actually show the monster in the monster movie.
Gotcha.
Could have been an incredible film. Just so.
All right. Well, Drucker goes on to say, can't wait to see TMNT, and TMNT 1990 and TMNT Secret of the Ooze need to be in the top 5. Also, I'm shocked. Can't hardly wait. Didn't make it on anyone's list, especially since CP loves Jennifer Love Hewitt. So.
Also true, but Drucker, I actually considered putting it on the list, but it violates our first rule because they're only at the graduation for like the first 5 minutes of the movie, and then it's all at the party after summer officially starts. So that's why we had to exclude it.
It's been a while since I've seen that movie, but probably time for a rewatch.
It's a good one.
Next up on our shoutouts is Ivor, who listed school movies: To Sir with Love, 3 O'Clock High, 10 Things I Hate About You, which is awesome. 10 Things I Hate About You is fantastic. Dead Poets Society, another one that we actually did consider. Great pick there, Ivor. I like that a lot. And Dazed and Confused. So there's actually some really good films in that list that weren't on ours. I totally agree with that list. That's awesome.
Good job.
He also said, let's not forget Footloose, Teen Wolf, Say Anything, Porky's, and Taps. So there were a lot of movies that maybe we didn't mention, CPs. Ivor, thanks for filling in those gaps. Appreciate it.
I'm feeling like maybe we need to do another episode.
Yeah, or maybe a longer conversation about school movies or something. That list is insane. Footloose, Teen Wolf, 10 Things I Hate About You. Those are all amazing.
Some very good ones there that we did not bring up.
Ivor also mentioned, I don't recall either of you talking about international movies. Are either of you planning to see Old Boy when it comes back to theaters in September? And then I think he corrected himself and said that it actually is out now. There are select theaters showing Old Boy, and I believe this is the dubbed version, right? The original.
I will be going to see it, Ivor. In fact, D-Man listed it when we did a ranking of our top 5 favorite. Oh, I remember our top 5 favorite non-English language films.
Yeah, the original's awesome. And still, what a shocker. So leave it at that. I'm not going to do any spoilers today. So next up on our shoutouts is Vicente from TikTok said, in reference to you going to see Blue Beetle, which we'll talk about that in a sec. He said, James Gunn meddling? Don't tell me you believe the Ben Affleck rumor. So CP, what is that about?
Apparently he is not a Restore Snyderverse person on TikTok. But, there have been a lot of accusations about what James Gunn did and what James Gunn promised. And then other people say that's not the case. So we'll just leave it at that. Vicente, right. I hope you saw the Blue Beetle, and I would love to know your thoughts, man.
Did you enjoy it at least? I mean, you don't have to give us a full scale review.
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Okay, cool. Next up on our shoutouts is Jazzy on YouTube. She said, I rented the 1989 Ninja Turtles. CP, is it 89?
That would be 1990, Jazzy. Sorry.
She said, I rented the 1989 Ninja Turtles. I loved it. I'm Splinter, and he learned how to fight from his cage, and he adopted the baby turtles. I love his heart. Also, April's the mom from Halloween Town, which I didn't know that.
Yep.
I literally, when she said that, I was like, really? I never put that together. Thank you. That was pretty cool. And then she said, P.S. Please be safe. I don't know how scary this hurricane is going to be. Don't die. We need more Total Rewind episode. Well, we didn't die, and the hurricane ended up not being so bad once it hit land. So it was basically just a storm. It just felt like rain. That was a little over dramatic in some areas, but I did see that because the hurricane did hit most of Southern California, there was a large amount of rainfall. So there was flooding in some areas, but other than that, not too bad. CB, did you feel the earthquake too?
I was too far south.
It's actually funny. I felt the earthquake, and then I'm on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. There was already a movie poster up. It was called Hurricane, and turning it into a whole thing. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's
and who knows? Maybe you and I will make that movie.
Could be the
So
next Sharknado.
and our final shout out this week goes out to Trisha, who commented on YouTube and said, in reference to Invaders from Mars, she went on to say, I saw this movie as a child. Granted, I'm old, but it was even before my time. But as a child growing up with atomic bomb shelters, UFO sightings, and no ratings on movies, we saw every movie in the theater. They were always playing over and over, maybe on the anniversary of the original release. The scariest thing to me was that no one believed him, which, yes, that really was the creepy. That like was the creepiest part, I think. All the people he was told would protect him, everyone that he trusted were after him. The ending that you disliked, that he was just dreaming, was the only way he could get through the movie and sleep at night, which is a good point because I think I was fairly critical of that ending at the time, where I was like, I'm not a big fan of it was all a dream, unless it's in a Notorious B.I.G. song. Yeah. She goes on to say, even today, when I ask friends my age, what was the scariest movie they ever saw? This is the number one answer. Number two, Flying Monkeys from Wizard of Oz, which, you know, Wizard of Oz is another movie that I got to give another watch. It's been a while. I feel like as a kid, it was always on.
Like classic movies, D-Man? I mean,
Not,
don't answer that on a movie podcast because we might have to replace you.
No, I'm going to the theater a lot, and then I'm watching the movies that we do total rewinds and movie remake times for. But I'm like, man, I need to sit down and just because we have with the streaming services. I mean, all these movies are accessible. You can go watch them. I think I need to do a better job. Well, that does it for our shout outs this week. So let's go ahead and jump into the main discussion. The discussion that, as I mentioned at the top, we have teased before. We've talked about wanting to talk about the Snyder Cut specifically. You have some very, very strong thoughts regarding Restore the Snyderverse movement, and you were a big supporter of the Snyder Cut in general. We've kind of danced around it. It's come up in some other topics where I think we've mentioned it, but we've never done the deep dive. And that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to throw it over to you because I want you to kick this off and let us know what you're thinking when we're talking about Avengers Endgame versus Snyder Cut Justice League.
So let's start out with this. Audience, this is actually a very timely conversation for two reasons. One, now that we're coming up on our soon to be 100th episode, we started thinking about what are some of the things that we've been promising you for a really long time that we haven't delivered on. And we've brought up multiple times that we're going to talk about these movies. So it's time to get into it. But it's actually very timely. When you look at Warner Brothers and DC, this conversation has really reemerged over the last few weeks regarding the release of Blue Beetle, the second to last official DCEU film, bringing up some, what do we think about James Gunn? What do we think about Zack Snyder? What's promised on the DC side of things? And simultaneously, Marvel is going through some growing pains of their own as Disney is deciding to start shelving some projects, scale back some of the potential Marvel films that are on the slate.
And definitely some of the TV shows.
Yes. So we just thought this was a good moment to really compare the creme de la creme of both these cinematic universes.
CP, I do want to just note at the top of the discussion that we are talking sort of Avengers Endgame versus Snyder Cut Justice League, but a more one-to-one discussion would probably be Avengers 1 versus Snyder Cut Justice League, because that's kind of the first team-up movie of the DCEU. But we went ahead and went with Endgame because, well, these were really the last major team-up movies. It's not our fault that DC didn't get to make anymore. Well, really, it's not our fault that Snyder did not get to make anymore. DC can do whatever they want.
They're going to keep making movies. Just not of this trilogy.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when you actually look at the birth of sort of the MCU and the DCEU, one of the things that is interesting is that they were both done, for instance, the Marvel MCU was started with a distribution deal through Marvel Studios with like Paramount and Universal. It wasn't owned by Disney at the time. And then if you actually think about, you go back to Man of Steel and they're making a Superman movie. At that time, I don't think they had this grand plan for the Justice League, at least not when they were making that movie, although maybe, who knows, they thought down the line. I think there were maybe some references in Man of Steel to like Bruce Wayne and Wayne Industries and tiny little things where it was like, there might be a connected world here. That might have even been added at the end digitally just to do it. It's interesting because I don't know to what degree either of them had this major plan to get us all the way to Endgame or Justice League when they actually started, rather than this developing out of the success of the films and the style. which is interesting because we like to think Kevin Feige knew all along we would get to Endgame. And maybe he did know that he wanted to bring, right at the end of the first Avengers, he's going to bring in Thanos as the shared universe's big bad. But do you think they had a vision to get all the way to Endgame from when they started, and vice versa? Do you think Zack Snyder had a vision to take this all the way to 3 Justice League movies? Or do you think they kind of just started piecing it together as they went?
I feel like when we look at Marvel, I think Marvel had a plan. If you remember, as you said, this was initially launched by quote unquote Marvel Studios. Marvel Studios was not owned by Disney. It was working, partnering with different studios in Hollywood to start rolling out these Marvel films. They were building towards a shared universe based off of the fact that we knew there were some characters that were crossing over between storylines in phase 1. But
Looking at you, Nick Fury and Coulson.
Right. But I don't think we were planning on all the way down 4 phases, 5 phases out. I think when you look at the DCEU, there were no plans. It seemed very much Warner Brother was on track. Their mindset was, let's replicate the success of the Dark Knight trilogy with Zack Snyder building a Superman trilogy. Everything that I've read from Henry Cavill and seen his interviews and Zack Snyder, it seems very clear that Nolan came on board. He approached Snyder and said, hey, let's do this with a new hero. And once Man of Steel came out, it was successful, but it was very clear that Warner Brothers felt their back was against the wall and they had to scramble and build this cinematic universe that they had not planned on building.
Well, you can tell.
Yeah, you can really tell.
I guess while we're on that topic, would you rather have gotten a Superman trilogy, or do you prefer what we actually got, which was the sort of Justice League culmination?
I would have loved to have seen a Man of Steel 2. Everything that I've ever heard from Henry Cavill and Zack Snyder sounds like it was what we needed to see the evolution of the character Superman. Dealing with the ramifications of fighting Zod, of killing Zod, I think that for the character Superman, it would have been amazing to finally get the Man of Steel 2.
Yeah, because I think what's actually interesting is when you get all the way to Endgame or all the way to the Snyder Cut, one of the things that really stands out is in order to truly enjoy Avengers Endgame, you really have to have been invested in the Marvel MCU. You don't have to have seen every movie, but you really should be invested for it to really pay off in that emotional way that it did for longtime fans of the franchise. Where I feel like the way they constructed Justice League, you could have seen some of the earlier movies, but I don't know if you fully needed to. The biggest thing being the death of Superman, right? That kind of kicked off the movie, and rightfully so, in Zack Snyder's Justice League, is actually the inciting incident that really kicks off the story, which is excellent. I think the way they restored that was fantastic, because that really is the thing, right? If Superman's not here, you can come here and get the mother boxes.
Yep.
I love that. I was so glad that they made that work, because in the theatrical release of Justice League, they just kind of were like, I don't know, he's gone.
Yeah, it was in sort of totally ancillary to the death of Superman. Just they happened to wake up one day and brought about the end of the world.
Yeah, randomly. Luck. Yeah, just I guess today's that day. I hope it never comes. All we got is the hurricane over here, so we're good, CP. The thing I'm getting at is, I think with the Justice League, though, because they kick off that opening sequence where Superman actually does die, it doesn't necessarily feel like you have to be invested in the other movies in the Snyderverse to actually enjoy the Snyder cut of Justice League. It does feel a little bit like you could just having never seen any of the other movies, put on Justice League and you'd be okay. Now, again, that 1-to-1 comparison, that's probably also true of Avengers 1 versus
in fact,
Endgame.
when you watch Avengers 1, they do a great job of reintroducing each of the Avengers as they meet each other on screen. If this is your first experience in the MCU, you can pick up who people are, what the power dynamics are, and what the personality clashes are.
Where the opposite, I think, is true of Endgame. I feel like in order to really enjoy that movie, you have to be invested in the MCU.
And I think otherwise, that's because there's too many characters. And so much of Endgame, the movie, is going back and revisiting where we have been as an audience throughout our MCU journey.
There's callback. It really isn't fan service. They're just paying out these things that they've laid for so many movies. Like Captain America being able to lift Thor's hammer. Like if this is the first Marvel movie you've seen, you'd be like, I don't get why that's a big deal. You just wouldn't know. You wouldn't get the callback when Iron Man snaps his fingers and says, I am Iron Man. You wouldn't appreciate those things the way you would if you're a fan. And so I think Endgame is a really unique viewing experience. It's really kind of cool because Marvel did something that I don't think has ever been done before. A franchise that literally spans 20 movies or so, right? Because I think, at this point, there's probably James Bond, but that's hardly one shared linear story. And then you got like Harry Potter, which was 8 movies.
Don't forget those Fast and Furious movies. Vin Diesel would be very
Are they all
disappointed.
connected though?
According to Vin Diesel, they are.
All right, so they got what, 10 Fast
I
X?
think 11.
Oh my gosh. All right, they're crazy. All right, yeah, so they're still going. It's interesting because I feel like Avengers Endgame then is only a recommend if you're talking to somebody who's willing to invest that time in the overall franchise than as a standalone film. Where I feel like I'd be like, hey, if you're into comic books and superheroes, I'd be like, check out Snyder Cut. Give it a watch. And then if you want more, you can go back and watch the earlier stuff.
I think that works. I think the other big difference is when we look at these two franchises, the personalities who are really behind calling the shots are in totally different positions, right? When we look at the history of the MCU, Kevin Feige was truly empowered, especially once Disney acquired Marvel, to execute the vision that he had constructed, the plan that was this multiple phase journey of these heroes. Whereas it seems like from the beginning of Nolan and Zack Snyder working on Man of Steel through Zack Snyder's cut of the Justice League, it was a total disaster over at Warner Brothers. There was massive leadership changes. Zack Snyder didn't even get to release the movie that he wanted to, which was Justice League. They brought in someone else. He shot the movie, changed it significantly. And there was so much backlash online that fans pushed Warner Brother into letting the man finish the movie that he made it. And I think those different experiences really say a lot about the Marvel vision versus the DC vision. And I feel like DC was just so reactive to everything that they never had a clear plan.
Something that is interesting to me is when you look at the Snyder Cut, it runs a little bit over 4 hours, correct?
Yeah.
Maybe a lot. What blows my mind is I know Zack Snyder is like, this was my vision for Justice League, but there's almost zero chance. I mean, there's almost zero chance that even if he got to finish Justice League and release his version, it was still going to be closer to 2 hours. So, or sorry, I said zero chance. There's almost zero chance that you would actually release theatrically the 4-hour cut.
Yeah.
It's going to get pared down to 2 hours. So on one hand, I know they put up probably $70 million to bring the Snyder Cut to life. And some of what's in there, I'm assuming, was done after the fact. You didn't have to cut now for time. But what do you think the Justice League would have been like if Snyder did have to cut it down? Because as much as the Snyder Cut gets applauded, there's just no way if it had originally been released even by him that it would be what it is today.
I think it would fall victim to many other Zack Snyder movies in that theater, specifically when you look at Watchmen and the original release of Batman vs Superman. Both of them, people were disappointed with the theatrical version. And then when Snyder comes out and says, okay, this is the director's cut, or in the case of both of them, the ultimate cut, where we have a whole extra 30 minutes, an hour of storytelling that we had to scrap for time, fans are really impressed when they get to see the completed vision. Now, I think this goes back to, again, the failure that is Warner Brothers when you say, look, Warner Brothers, you're having a guy here who has a track record for making 3-hour movies. Why are you forcing him to cut them down to 2 hours and then complain that the movies are bombs? Get the guy that makes the 2-hour movie and makes it well.
Yeah.
If you're going to hire a guy who does a 3-hour movie, give him the 3-hour movie that he envisions.
Or a part 1 or a part 2. Or even I know there at times were discussions about releasing the Snyder Cut as maybe more of a mini series, like because it's broken up into those chapters. There was talk about potentially releasing it not episodically, but just by part. I mean, they do one big dump, but it would be broken up that way narratively. I'm fascinated because obviously everybody's like, oh, this was his vision all along. I'm like, well, his vision was over 4 hours. And that was never going to be the thing.
And when you see interviews with Zack, when he talks about the Snyder Cut, he talks about the power of hindsight and being able to tell this story after other films had been released within DC. He's able to integrate them better.
That's interesting.
In ways that I mean, there's no way he could have planned that out.
Well, I just bring it up because, I think there's this, it's like release the Snyder Cut, but really like they went back, they spent a lot of money doing the Snyder Cut. It's definitely not necessarily what would have ended up in theaters, which is pretty cool. It's interesting that WB caved into the fan pressure there and put up some money. I don't know. I know the year it was released, I think the Snyder Cut was one of the top streamed movies on HBO Max or
Mm-hmm.
Max. I don't know if it still is, but it did well when it got released. So that's pretty cool. I would bet they got some signups for that.
Right here, one of them,
It-
one of those
yeah,
signups.
I'd bet people signed up for HBO Max at that time because they're like, dang, I want to see the Snyder Cut. Be like, all right, let's do it. So, CP, narratively, then,
Okay.
when you look at the two movies, they're doing really different things. I think Avengers Endgame is paying out all of the story setups and character arcs that have been going into the MCU for 20 movies.
Yeah.
Where the Justice League, I feel like they're not really paying out a lot of narrative arcs. I mean, Zack Snyder seems concerned with this sort of like, superheroes as gods.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
He talks a lot about that. His vision for the movies that he made within the DCEU were to explore what would life be like if we met people with superpowers out there.
Yeah, because I do think there's kind of this, right? I mean, especially some of the ways that he shot Superman in the past from the ground with him floating in the sun and really making him sort of a godlike figure. Even the statue that gets erected in, is that the end of Batman versus Superman?
In Metropolis,
Yeah,
they build it at the end of Man of Steel
Man of
because
Steel.
it
Oh
gets
yeah,
blown
yeah.
up in Batman vs Superman.
Yeah, that's right. And it gets degraded as well, correct? Because the thing is, like, what's interesting with what Zack Snyder's doing here is he's really just exploring how humanity might need heroes, but also why do we sort of hold our heroes up on these mantles, right? Is it
Mm-hmm.
because of their powers, or do we hold them up just because we need heroes?
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know, that's fascinating to me because you look at things like old mythology and storytelling, some of the things I've watched interviews with George Lucas, and he's talking about Star Wars and how cultures are built around myths
Yep.
and all of this stuff. And I'm like, that he's really exploring that in an interesting way. Even though obviously there's things to be critical about, I think it was very interesting for me once you see the big picture of what Zack Snyder was actually exploring.
Absolutely. Which is a good contrast to what the MCU is doing, which is for the most part, these characters are kind of regular people who find some way of stumbling across superpowers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Spider-Man gets bit by a spider. Captain America gets super soldier serum. Iron Man builds an Iron Man, or Tony Stark builds an Iron Man suit. None of these characters are innately great.
Well, greatness being defined as superpowers?
Yeah, well, they're not portrayed in the same way. We are with these characters as they discover and uncover their superpowers. Even when we consider a character like the Flash in Justice League, who is a regular person, who gets one of those superhero type events where he is blessed with superpower. We don't actually ever see that portion of the Flash character. We don't explore that. We meet the Flash once he is this super being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only character in the MCU that is really godlike is, in fact, Thor.
Mm-hmm.
The MCU, I think, does a good job of exploring his personal character arc, which really is just the question, is he worthy?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What makes somebody worthy of that godlike status? And Thor constantly is challenging that, right? Is he supposed to be king? Maybe not. That's his birthright, but he doesn't have to do it, right? And I think the MCU, I don't know, they do a good job of taking this godlike character and instead they sort of humanize him with comedy and humor and a love interest. They bring him down to earth, where I don't think in the Snyderverse, he's trying to bring these godlike characters down to earth. They are gods.
Mm-hmm.
They're not regular, everyday sort of people in the Snyderverse,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know which one I like more. I think Marvel's is easier. It's easier going, if that makes sense. It gets a little bit more fun. That's why everyone always acknowledges Marvel's humor, right? They make funny characters and this and that, and then everybody looks at the Snyderverse and they're like, they never tell a joke. And then Joss Whedon steps in and releases the Justice League, and everyone was like, yeah, this is trash. We don't want the jokes.
Try to make jokes.
Yeah, we don't want the jokes over here. I would lean more towards my preference being the MCU style. I think I do like that a little bit more, but I do have a lot of respect for what Zack Snyder was trying to do narratively.
Well, I think what's nice is Zack Snyder as a director is very aware that he doesn't want to retread the ground that we've gone as an audience through our viewing of the MCU films. He wanted to present something different. I think in many ways it's probably more accurate because in a world, if suddenly we woke up tomorrow and there's a bunch of superheroes running around, I think as a society we would behave much more like people do in the Snyderverse. Some people are afraid of them. Some people want to use them. Some people are infatuated and worship them, as opposed to a world where we just are super psyched that Tony Stark is flying around and we want to get our picture with Spider-Man.
Or the Hulk.
Yeah,
At
right.
that
The Hulk's
diner.
a better example.
Not Ant-Man, though. We are looking now at the narratives for each of these. So I'm just going to lay them out there. Essentially, Avengers Endgame is the second half to Avengers Infinity War, which is the villain Thanos collects the Infinity Stones so he can snap away half of the universe and the other half can thrive, which he achieves at the end of that. And then Avengers Endgame is about undoing that, traveling back in time, collecting the stones, and doing their own snap to bring everyone back and essentially defeat Thanos. Where I think the Snyder Cut, it's essentially you have a villain who's trying to regain favor with his boss. And to do that, he's got to collect 3 objects hidden on Earth, bring them together to restore their home world and bring his boss home and then regain his favor. In both of those, it's the Avengers trying to stop Thanos and it's the Justice League trying to stop Steppenwolf. Do you think either of those work really well? Like, what works, what doesn't for you?
Oh boy. Let's start with Justice League.
Okay.
And as we said, we're not even going to go into the crap that was the Josh Whedon version of the Justice League, where that story isn't so well created. I think a couple things work really, really well in the Snyder Cut. For one, it's a reference back to events that happened earlier on in world history, quote unquote, in the Age of Heroes, when Darkseid and the forces of Apocalypse came the first time and were defeated. This is their second attempt at reconquering Earth. 2, the heroes are forced to deal with a undefended Earth in the absence of Superman. And what does that mean? And 3, there is a ticking clock as we watch Steppenwolf acquire different mother boxes throughout the movie. I think those work really well, which is building towards the final battle where they're going to have to show down and try and save Earth from the forces of Apocalypse. Great. When we look at Endgame, the first problem I have with Endgame is what's the this 5-year gap between the events of Infinity War and Endgame is a really long time. But for me, the issue that I have is we actually see the Avengers beat Thanos very quickly. The first 20 minutes of the movie, they find him, they kill Thanos, and they spend the rest of the movie on their quest to reacquire the Infinity Stones so that they can, in fact, undo what he did. I think that that's problematic because the movie should end with that moment where they finally face Thanos. And I mean, granted, they do encounter Thanos, but
it's a different version of Thanos.
I feel like it's cheapened because it's not the Thanos who ended the world for us.
That, and I'm never a huge fan of just exposition dumps or just things happening because you need it to happen. An example being like they need to figure out time travel. I don't know. Tony Stark's just running different algorithms or whatever. And then he's like, oh, all right, I figured it out. You're like, well, that's convenient. I mean, from a story standpoint, I totally get it. They're like, hey, we need to go back in time and we don't really have enough time to like explore how you figured out time travel. So just have him do it. It always just seems like such a cop out. Like, oh, well, that was convenient.
Yeah,
you know?
a little bit, right?
He's pretty sure that it's impossible. There's no way we're not going to do it. And then it just works. And you're like, all right. Now, that's not really a problem with the movie. Like I said, that's just a plot device. They just need to be able to go back in time. You could maybe execute that a little better, just so it doesn't feel so like, oh, okay, here's time travel. At the same time, they did leave breadcrumbs with the quantum realm. And there are mentions, with the time stone and different things. So there is this notion that you can time travel or at least potentially time travel. So that's not wild.
Yeah. The concept is brought up in the MCU before this.
But with Endgame, I think the thing that let me down a little bit, just from a story perspective, was that when they do face Thanos at the end, it's, as you mentioned, it's a Thanos from a different timeline. What ends up happening is it doesn't have a lot of narrative weight then, because they actually did kill the Thanos who did what caused them to get pissed off. So when they're facing this other Thanos, it's really weird because I think he even says to Wanda, she's like, you have no idea what you've taken from me. He's like, I don't even know who you are.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I thought that was like a little not as good, dude. Realistically, you could just have this guy come in from infinite timelines and like face these guys, but it's not really the same guy.
Mhm.
It's a different guy. There, I don't know. There's something about that just I don't. It doesn't click for me. And then because of that, because they bring this Thanos from a different timeline, I didn't really like how he's like, now that I see that I was successful and wiped out half the universe, but you guys want to undo it because you're not grateful. I know now that I need to destroy everything and rebuild from the ground up. And I'm like, that's like a stupid
Motivation,
yeah.
justification.
Yeah, justification, I think is the word I'm looking for. Like that's a stupid justification because if you're just going to destroy everything, why wouldn't you just let it play out then and destroy itself? Like who gives a shit then? If you're just going to destroy it all, then what's the point of any of it?
I think the big thing is it's so contrary to the calculating and motivated Thanos character we have seen throughout the rest of the MCU.
Well, because the point is that, like, in this instance, he literally says, like, and then everybody will be grateful. But I'm like, the irony is the Thanos that we meet in Infinity War isn't worried at all about people being grateful. He's literally saying, I'll do the thing that nobody will thank me for, that nobody else is willing to do. I will do it. And then he literally isn't, oh, I end up wanting to be a god or I want some sort of riches. He's like, I'm just going to go rest on my farm. He's like, my work is done. And then this other Thanos comes in at the end of Endgame and he's like concerned with people being grateful to him and a grateful universe. I'm like, I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem like the same guy to me. Like narratively, because they so easily defeat Thanos, who is weakened from having done the snap, they defeat Thanos. It is kind of weird because he only really uses the Infinity Stones like once or twice in Endgame, unlike in Infinity War where he's got the gauntlet and he's literally using them like against everybody, which was awesome.
As he's fighting, yeah.
So he doesn't really use the Infinity Stones all that much because he can barely get the gauntlet on. Because of how easily Thor just chopped his head off at the beginning of the movie, I really think the Avengers could defeat Thanos without the Infinity Gauntlet, like no problem.
Well, that's how it's presented.
Like, I don't think they would have a problem with him. I mean, obviously, he could fight the Hulk one-on-one, but he didn't kill the Hulk. And not only that, but I think if all of them were teaming up, clearly they could beat him.
Yeah.
And in this instance, he's fighting them, but he doesn't actually have the Infinity Gauntlet. He only gets it on like once, and then he takes one of the stones out and like hits Captain Marvel. That was one of the weird things about Endgame that if I had to nitpick at anything was that I felt like narratively they undercut Thanos' story because he is such a great villain in Infinity War. Like he's awesome. His motivation is great. He's kind of going around. He's definitely got the monologues. He's doing the whole thing, but he's powerful. He's got the stones. He is a fantastic villain. He's probably one of Marvel's best villains. Now, I'll just say this on the other side. Not a fan of Steppenwolf at all. I didn't really care for it. I thought he was defeated way too easily. Like basically like Superman just came back and it was like, oh, okay, so never mind then.
I mean, that is pretty much true. With all the encounters with Steppenwolf beforehand, he's a formidable foe. But as soon as the pieces reset, Superman is on the board. It's nothing.
I mean, they beat him really quickly. Like, and he didn't even really have a chance. So, and I mean, he literally didn't get. It's not like Loki. Like they didn't arrest him. They like literally cut his head off. Like he's dead.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I didn't find him to be compelling at all. I mean, the only aspect of his character that's a tad interesting is he's trying to regain favor with Darkseid.
Mm-hmm.
There's a history there that maybe was a little bit worth exploring. But other than that, he just seemed like a guy who's like, I just want to take over the world.
No, and I mean, that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
so
there's not a lot more motivation than that behind the character.
That's the thing is with, these villains, if you can come up with a very compelling villain, I think you're just going to get a better story. And in this instance, I think Thanos is an incredibly, incredibly compelling villain. He was able to match up with all of the Avengers using the Infinity Stones and really be a formidable challenge to what they represent.
Well, and what you're pointing to, though, is the fact that Thanos was he is teased at the end of the first Avengers movie. And we get to see him as we're exploring the rest of the MCU, building to infinity. We don't get that with Steppenwolf. Thanos and Loki are probably the best villains created in the MCU. And the reason why both of them work so well as characters is their arcs and their motivations are explored over multiple films. Steppenwolf shows up and he's born and died in the same movie.
Even Avengers 1. As far as Avengers films go, Ultron might be that sort of villain, and that's probably why he's one of the weaker villains in the MCU.
Yep.
Because if you think about it, Loki gets to step in in the Avengers, but we've already explored his character in Thor. So we know what motivates him. We know he will stab you in the back. We know, he's an untrustworthy trickster. We know he feels entitled to a throne and all this stuff where like a petulant child, where it's like, dude, grow up.
Yeah.
But it makes sense why he would partner with this shadowy figure to get an army so that he can rule a world, because he feels like he got shorted. He should be the ruler of Asgard, but he's not. And it kills him. I don't know. He's very compelling. And Thanos is very compelling. And I feel like, and even in the Snyder Cut Justice League, Steppenwolf's just not very compelling.
And again, the comparison to Thanos is the character Darkseid, who is introduced in pieces, right? In the same way as we learn about Thanos initially from other people talking about him, we're getting the same thing with Darkseid. We're seeing his interactions with other characters before we truly get his interactions with the Justice League, which we're never going to get now. When we
see, they might have had a
planting of the seeds for who Darkseid is, we can see it's being built in the same way as the planting of the seeds as to who Thanos.
If you really look at like Infinity War, it really is a movie built around the villain, Thanos. It's his mission in that film to collect the stones, and the Avengers just have to try to stop him. So he's the one with the motivation. He's the one with the momentum in the story. He's moving it forward by collecting each new stone. In the Snyder Cut, instead of stones, we have mother boxes. They're not, again, it's kind of like you said, like the Infinity Stones have now been built up over the entirety of the MCU as these incredibly powerful objects that can do very specific things. And we get to the mother boxes in the Snyder Cut and Justice League. To this day, I'm not even 100% sure what they do. Again, they just feel like a plot device. You just need to collect something so that something can happen. But they don't build it up to have any sort of history to it, any sort of power other than, it's like, if these mother boxes were here, why don't characters use them? You look at in the first Avengers, the Tesseract, they were trying to power weapons with it and do stuff, which is exactly what you think people would do if these powerful objects were here. Now, I understand too, CP, don't get mad at me, the mother boxes were only awakened once Superman died. But they just felt like the thing you need to get so that the thing can happen. I don't know.
So you're not a fan of mother boxes. I get that. You're not a fan of the villain. I get that too. Is there anything that you really think works in the narrative structure then of Justice League?
Yeah, Cyborg. I thought in the Snyder Cut Justice League, I thought narratively his arc is fantastic.
Which ironically, his origins are based on the use of the mother box before they know it's a mother box. So
which is great.
Actually does the one thing that you were just complaining about, but continue.
That's why I'm bringing him up. I'm saying that I think is the thing they do right. I feel like narratively, he's also the main Justice League thread through that movie that really makes it all work. And the fact that they cut all that out of the theatrical version is wild to me.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it literally, his arc is really the arc of the film. And Zack Snyder nails that aspect of it. I thought it was great. Once that was restored, I thought it made the story much more powerful and a lot better. Because the thing is, like, in a Justice League movie, it's kind of weird, but like Superman really isn't around a whole lot. He's dead for a lot of it. To me, that's kind of weird because it's like there's all this talk about, oh, Superman's dead and that's the catalyst and we need to bring him back and all this stuff. But, as a character, he's not really in it. And then even when he comes out, like he has like amnesia, kind of doesn't remember things until he does. And then he just sort of like rejoins the team. But then he's got the problems that every iteration of Superman has ever had, which is that he's like unbeatable. And then like once he steps in, you're like, whatever. But I think until then, Cyborg's story is awesome. I think it works really well.
So what do you think about the time travel aspect of Endgame?
I have two thoughts on it. The first is that I really am not a huge fan of time travel as a narrative plot device, because obviously I when I left Infinity War, I was talking to my wife on the car ride home and I was like, I really hope they don't just like time travel and undo it all, which is exactly what happened. Because it just, when you can do that, it sort of makes anything that's happened, why isn't it an option to like use time travel to go back in time and like prevent Tony from dying and having the Hulk use his other arm or something, it just, I don't know, time travel just, I'm not a huge fan of it, but in this instance, all right, we're going with it, right? What I do like about the time travel that they implement here is when they go back to places that have been explored before in the past of the MCU, but more than that, they get to meet characters who are no longer with us. They also are characters that help close the main narrative arcs for our main Avengers. Notably, Tony Stark gets to talk to his father, who he's always had daddy issues. He's a dad now himself, and he gets to have this conversation with his dad where he realizes that his dad always loved him. And they never got to get that sort of closure because of his untimely death by the Winter Soldier. I think that worked really well. And then, of course, Thor, who's probably the most wrecked Avenger at this point. You know, he has no self-esteem. He's basically just like,
He's lost
screw
his
it.
hammer. He's lost his sexy Thor body. He's lost his kingdom. He's lost his parents.
Yeah, he's lost
Technically
everything.
lost his brother.
He gets a chance to see his mom, and we've talked about this before, but I think more than anything, it just restores his confidence, but in a way that parents can do, meaning that he really did probably need to go see his mom.
Mm-hmm.
He was lost. And obviously, she's not saying anything that nobody else has told him or that he probably doesn't know deep down. Sometimes we need that reassurance from our parents. That's why we miss them so much when they're gone. They give us that confidence. They imbue that to us in a way that just, it's almost impossible to come from anybody else. Yeah. And so being able to go do that, only allowed by time travel, I think makes it a little bit more necessary. Time travel can kind of just be someplace. Like, if you actually think of it as like a plot device, time travel is literally like, if you just remove the aspect of time, really, they just went somewhere and got something.
Okay, so let me present it to you this way. Because technically in Justice League, in the Snyder Cut, there are 2 instances of time travel in that movie. What are your opinions on that use? And just for the audience, the first one, if you remember, is when Cyborg drops the mother box into the Kryptonian regeneration chamber. The Flash is supposed to hit it at that exact moment to ignite the spark, which is going to jolt Superman to life. That's the first instance. He misses it by a split second, goes back and redoes it correctly. The second and more important one is at the end of the movie, when Flash does not show up in time, he does not allow Cyborg to fuse with the mother box. It creates the unity, it opens the portal, and Darkseid kills all the Justice Leaguers.
Just in general, not necessarily a huge fan because it kind of gets explored in The Flash. But when you introduce plot mechanism like that, like he can just go back in time. I mean, now you can just have him do that anytime. That's, I think, what sort of bothers me. And The Flash does explore that. He comes to the conclusion that he can't do that, right? He should not be doing that, which is great. I think at the end of the day, that movie kind of settles like, yeah, he's not going to keep going back in time to undo things. The things that happen, and we got to let it be.
Yep.
But we didn't have the Flash when this happened. And so, I'm not a fan then of just having that accessible to the characters of just like, oh, we can just undo it. I think it just destroys narrative weight associated with storytelling. If you can always just undo things, then the stakes and the consequences of people's choices, they just don't carry as much weight because you're like, well, I mean, the Flash could just undo it. To me, I'm not a huge fan of that. I mean, the way they did it in the film, I think was fine though. Like, I don't have a problem with the way it was executed. I think it worked fairly well. It was more so just time travel as a plot device, I think, that I'm critical of. So, but I think it works. We've seen time travel in many different forms, from Looper to Harry Potter to Avengers, Back to the Future. Do you like time travel?
I'm not usually a fan of time travel. And my issue with Avengers Endgame and the use of time travel is it feels so unjustified, right? As you said, I know we're using, we're diving into Ant-Man and Doctor
the quantum realm
and all these things.
Time stone.
My issue is the fact that, considering the amazing job the MCU did with setting up these clues that are the Infinity Stones for the audience. And we've been on this journey, and as finally Thanos is going around collecting Infinity Stones, we're saying to ourselves as an audience, I know where that is. I know where that is. I know that's this one. That's this one. Problem that I feel about the time travel solution is I wish that there was some other solution that the Avengers could have gone to that had already been rolled out in the fabric of the MCU.
Yeah.
And it feels like, as an audience, we're kind of like, well, we didn't really know that was there. And I wish that there was something that we could have gone to in the same way building up to Endgame, where forums and people would post YouTube videos and everyone was trying to figure out what was going to happen based off the clues that had been planted for us as the audience. And I felt that if they had been able to construct a story using clues that had been planted, it would have truly been the conclusion of everything that they had built so far, as opposed to just saying, well, like, yeah, we'll build a time machine, we'll go back, boom, boom, boom. Problems.
You mean something, this is just an example, but like something closer to like the Horcruxes and Harry Potter, and those were laid throughout the entire story. So that when that revelation comes, you're like, oh, okay. So, we kind of had to read the whole thing.
There's a reason
And
why Tom Riddle's dollar matters.
yeah,
Exactly.
I kind of get it because I do love in Avengers Endgame. I mean, like you said earlier, I love that they really take the focus down to the original set of Avengers. They sort of explore all of their character arcs and they get to close most of them. Thor's still around, but he's kind of on a different path now. I loved in Endgame that we really got the closure for the characters who we started this journey with. And I think that was one of my most favorite things about Endgame is I respect so much that Marvel A called it Endgame and B actually ended the story.
Mm-hmm.
Hypothetically, you could watch all the way to Endgame, be fine.
Mm-hmm.
That was the story. And now after Endgame, there's more story to be had. The characters didn't all die and we can go do something else. But I was so happy that they narratively like actually ended it. I remember thinking at one point, I was like, this could hypothetically just like go on forever. So like at what point do you just get tired of it and you're like, I don't really care anymore,
Yeah.
And so there's other things that play with movie universes that you can't do in comics where like, hey, I mean, Robert Downey Jr. is getting older, or maybe he doesn't want to do it anymore, or an actor could pass away or something. There's things that might limit some of the storytelling just from a aspect like that. But I just had so much respect that Marvel was like, yes, we are going to end this story with the Infinity Stones and Tony and Thor and Captain America, all a Hulk and all. I was like, I thought it was fantastic. I loved how they did it. I have a question for you.
I have an answer for you. What's up?
Who should have done the final snap, Iron Man or Captain America?
I think the decision to make Iron Man do it works in the sense that when we first meet Tony Stark at the beginning of the MCU journey, he's this selfish player. There's that
Definitely.
great scene where him and Captain get into it on the Shield helicarrier.
In Avengers.
Tony Stark is not the guy to lay down on the wire, right?
Yeah.
And that is who Captain America is. And so for the completion of Tony Stark's arc, he has to be the guy willing to lay down on the wire. And that's what
Dude, I love that. Yeah, I think it's excellent. And it literally is a callback to that where he says, like, I think I would just cut the wire. He always has a workaround. And Captain America is kind of alluding to the fact that, like, yes, you're a smart guy, but like eventually there might be a time where you got to sacrifice yourself. Mm-hmm. Are you that guy? Avengers also posits that Tony will do this because he's willing to carry the nuke into space. But at the end of the day, I mean, Endgame literally completes his arc. He has that great line where he's like, part of the journey is the end. I was so happy that Endgame really put a cap on the story and said like, hey, this is a complete story. And you don't have to watch any of this other stuff. But if you love our stuff, we're going to tell another great story. Mm-hmm. For this, it's complete. And I just have so much respect because that's such a dangerous thing to do. Kill Iron Man. But like, that's his story. It just works so beautifully. I love it. And I respect them for actually killing some people. And again, I know that might have to do with contracts or, people are done with their characters, whatever. They did it in a narrative way where it's like, wow, this all makes sense. It makes sense why we started with Iron Man and why we followed him all the way.
So narrative structure for Endgame, narrative structure for Justice League. Which one do you think is?
Ooh, I really like Cyborg's story. And as I mentioned, I think the only thing holding Endgame back is that it has required viewing in order to truly enjoy it. But I think I'm going to give the tip of the cap here to Avengers Endgame, with the reason being that with Endgame, Marvel did something no one's ever been able to do before. They were able to successfully end a 20 movie long story. Does that require you to watch some other stuff in order to really enjoy it? Yes, but I think they did it really, really well. Where I think the Snyder Cut, it does have a fairly decent narrative. Like I said, I think I like Cyborg's story and I like how Zack Snyder reframed that around him. But if I had to give a nod to one, I'm giving it to Endgame. Now, I have a feeling you're going to disagree with me on this.
I'm going to go Snyder Cut. And
yeah,
I think Zack Snyder's Justice League is a very cohesive, self-contained story. And though, I mean, you brought it up at the beginning, though events leading up to the death of Superman take place in other films, the movie starts out with Superman dying. And from there, it is this new tale about what is the world like once its protector is gone. And in that case, it is a self-contained story that's rather quote unquote straightforward. The result is the birth of the Justice League. And I think it works really well.
Yeah, and I do love when the Justice League all actually are together at the end, and you're like, oh, dude, like they kind of need everyone too in order to make it work, which was great. I think in Zack Snyder's cut, it definitely feels like everybody has a place on the team. I don't know. In the theatrical version, I'm not gonna lie, it felt like they just teamed them up to team them up. It's just kind of like, I don't know, let's go find these superhumans and like build a team. You're like, I guess. So CP, that does it for part 1 of this podcast. Now, there is a lot more to discuss, and we're going to get into some of the other topics and things like that. But for part 1, I had a lot of fun. That was good discussion, and I know how passionate you are about the Snyderverse. To our listeners, be sure to keep the conversations going. Ask us some questions, and we'll be sure to answer them in social media. And then tune in next week, because we are going to have a part 2 where we continue talking about and break down some of the characters, some of the visuals, and some of that stuff. So be sure, keep the conversation going. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. We look forward to coming back next week with the other half of this episode. CP, take us out.
Thanks for checking out this week's episode of Filmmakers Compass Podcast. We will see you back here next week to keep talking about the Snyderverse and Endgame. Until then, you should probably go watch both the movies so you know where we're at.